Welcome back to Pondering in the Pines, guys. So today we're working on another spring foraging recipes, but we're using these spruce tips. Now, just a quick note, anytime you're doing wild foraging, please make sure that you know exactly what it is that you're foraging. Do a little bit of research before you go out. Take a friend that has more experience. Hit us up on email. We're happy to send you some information about pictures. And there's numerous plant identification groups all over Facebook that do have professionals in their field. But there are a couple species of pine tree that are mildly toxic to somewhat more toxic. Yew pine, Norfolk pine, those are going to be the big ones that might grow in the United States, but generally don't grow naturally here, at least not in Colorado. So today we're using spruce tips, which gives us a beautiful, bright, citrusy flavor. Now you can use any part of the pine needles, but I really like these neon green, fresh sprouts. So these are just popping out. This is going to be the new growth from the pine trees this year. And for our mead recipe, we are going to do a specific gravity meter reading. So if you have a hydrometer, it's called, these are a really useful thing, but it gives us a potential alcohol by volume measurement here. So that's going to be a percentage going up. And once our mixture's done, we'll give it a measurement to see if we can't figure out kind of more or less where it's going to be. For now, though, in terms of measurements, we're using a 1 gallon jug. So that's 128 ounces. And my general ratio for mead is going to be 30% honey by weight. So not by volume. You don't want to fill up a third of a gallon with honey, as your yeast is going to have a hard time with that. And at some point, it's going to stall out. But 30% of that by weight. This is a 23-ounce jar, and we already have one in there. So we're looking at about another third of this jar to make our mixture proper starting gravity. Now, when I first got started making meads and other wild foraging things, I was very much an old world methodology where things were just ratios. But the more I get into it, the more having these actual scientific measurements and precise units really gives you a better idea of what could have gone wrong if something goes wrong. And especially if you're making alcoholic beverages, it's nice to know how high the content of your wine or your mead actually is. So we've got our honey and our water going here. It's actually getting pretty close to hot already. Now, if you're just going to do a basic honey and water mead, you don't really need to cook everything before you combine it together, put it in your bottle, and add your yeast. But because we're using spruce tips today, these are going to have a wild yeast on them. And what we don't want is for any competing wild yeast to produce off flavors in our mixture or to compete with our Lalvin EC1118 yeast, which is actually a champagne yeast, but it's one of my favorites for making mead. Gives us a nice dry finish and usually a higher alcohol by volume than a lot of other comparable wine yeasts. So for this one, at least 2 cups worth of these spruce tips is going to be kind of the recipe. And we're just going to dump it in with our honey and water mixture. Now, this is going to also increase the amount of spruce flavor in our beginning mixture. And there's various philosophies about leaving in our herbs or your plants or flavorings throughout primary fermentation. So what we're going to do is leave all of this spruce tip goodness in the jar as we go through our fermentation process. But a lot of people will strain this out before it goes in there so they don't have little chunks and bits. Either way, you're going to have to filter this out at least once more before it gets bottled up. And I do like that stronger flavor profile as opposed to just a quick cooking of our mixture to begin with. So check back in just a couple minutes here. All right, guys, so we've had our mixture boiling here for just a couple minutes, and you can see that it's kind of changed the color of our spruce tips. We've gone from a neon green to kind of a little bit of a darker drab olive green. And we don't want that honey to really boil over. So I'm going to shut off this mixture and get started on the next part of the process. All right, so if you have enough time and not doing really anything with your day, go ahead and just let this mixture cool until it's back down to room temperature. You do want to keep it covered because you don't really want any spores or bacteria starting to grow in there. We're just going to go ahead and pour it in our brewing container. And I went ahead and put a little bit of ice in there to cool it off faster for the intents and purposes of this video. But if you have the time, it really is better to just let it do its thing in a more prolonged timeline, come down to temperature naturally. That will also give you more of a timeline to let the spruce tips kind of simmer and steep as a tea in there with that water. So at this point, we have our spruce tips all down at the bottom. We have our honey mixture, and that's still a little bit hot to be able to add your yeast to it. So you don't really want to add yeast if you're over 110 degrees, and you shouldn't add yeast, in my opinion, until you're down to about 90 degrees Fahrenheit or about 33 to 35 degrees Celsius. So what we can do at this point is take our specific gravity reading. Now again, we're looking at potential alcohol by volume. So this gives us a rough idea of how alcoholic by percentage our mixture might be. Or you can look at specific gravity measurements on the backside. These are not my favorite. I prefer to use the potential alcohol by volume. So the way that this works is it's weighted, but it's also full of air. So it's going to give us a floating point in the bottle, and we hope it doesn't go all the way to the bottom, which it mostly did, because now I have to reach in there and get it. But our liquid came up to right about there. So this mixture with the current amount of honey in it has about a 12% alcohol by volume potential. Now, I have a tendency to run multiple fermentations. So after we ferment for about a month in this jar with our spruce, this will actually get poured into another sanitary gallon jug. And we're going to add a little bit more honey to it and try and boost that potential alcohol by volume. Generally, my meads end up being somewhere around 16 to 18% by volume. So a little bit stronger, but still nice and dry. For now, we just got to walk away from this and let it cool down, but check back in just a little bit. All right, guys, so we've come down in temperature. That took about 30 minutes or so for this gallon jug in the fridge to go from about 140 degrees to about 93 degrees Fahrenheit. So at this point, we're ready to pitch our yeast. Now, if you're OCD or just really want to make sure everything's done properly, you can take your yeast packet and a little bit of the mixture in your jug, and that would go just in another vessel, and you mix the two together so that you have a liquid mixture to pour in. And I've been doing this a long time, and simplicity, there's nothing wrong with it. So what we're going to do is take our packet of yeast and just pitch it directly into our gallon bottle. And as it spreads out on the surface, you're going to see it start to falling through the mixture. And it won't take very long till this actually starts to produce carbonation, some CO2, as it starts to eat up that sugar in the honey and turn it into lovely, lovely wine. Now, last step. This needs an airlock. There's multiple different models of these. These are actually probably the cheapest, and they don't last a super long time. So it's actually going to be 3 pieces here. You have your bung cap. So this is going to go directly up top. And before you do this, you do want to make sure to sanitize it. So mine's already been through Star Sani rinse. Now it also has our cylinder and also the actual airlock here on the top. So this airlock is going to allow gas from our mixer to come up into the cylinder. It will lift up this interior piece and it will bubble out through these little slotted holes. And that allows the carbonation, the excess CO2 to escape without causing your mixture to actually explode, or the bottle itself. So I fill these with 50% glycerin, 50% water. You can just use water itself, but again, you don't want to make sure that any of this that you're using is going to be sterilized before you start to use it. And look, we're already starting to get some action from our yeast. You can see it had fallen down to the bottom initially, and now it's beginning to rise back up to the top. So it'll be chewing up that sugars here pretty rapidly. But that last piece goes on top. And now in about a month, this fermentation will be done. And you could drink it at that point, but it's going to be pretty fiery in terms of alcohol flavor. Now, if you're following a lot of more old recipes or ancient recipes for this, Roman mead or Viking mead would oftentimes be left for a minimum of 3 months and sometimes upwards of 3 years. So this is one that you can just stick in your closet and forget about. As long as it's in a temperature stable place, nothing's really going to happen to it. Maybe about once a month, check in and make sure that your water is still up to the minimum fill line. That's part of why I use the glycerin mixture, is it doesn't evaporate quite as fast as just water does. And you can actually forget about it for a little bit longer before having to check on it to make sure that you still have water in here. If you don't have water in here, air can get into your mixture, and that can cause both off flavors, and it can cause other yeast or bacteria to start growing, and you might ruin your batch. So you really don't want to have that happen. So definitely make sure there's water in here. But at this point, you can already see if we can zoom in on this a little bit. You can already see it starting to bubble in the airlock on top. So it really gets going after a while, and it's definitely a lot of fun to watch it ferment. But that's going to be our spruce mead. And if you like recipes like this, if you enjoy wild foraging and wild food making, tune in next time to Pondering on the Pines. Drop us a like and a follow. Let us know what you'd like to see us work on next for our kitchen recipes.